Good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's virtual book talk with the Tenement Museum. My name is Kat Lloyd. I'm the Director of Programs in the Tenement Museum's Education Department. It's my pleasure to welcome you all here virtually to our discussion this evening. So tonight's conversation on the book In the Shadow of Slavery, African Americans in New York from 1626 to 1863. This conversation really generates from the museum's newest initiative to introduce stories of Black and African American experiences to the stories that we've been exploring at the Tenement Museum for decades. So this month, just last week, the Tenement Museum launched a virtual tour, Reclaiming Black Spaces, that interprets history of Black communities in the area that we now know as the Lower East Side. And next month, in mid-June, we'll launch a walking tour that visits these same sites. So this is part of an ongoing effort at the museum to really expand who we talk about when we talk about stories of migration, belonging, American identity, as the Tenement Museum has done since 1988. So in this ongoing effort, and you might have heard this, last month, we announced the Tenement Museum's next permanent exhibit, where we will recreate the home of an African-American couple, Joseph and Rachel Moore, who lived in a tenement in a neighborhood just west of the Lower East Side in the 1860s. And Joseph and Rachel Moore, they didn't live at 97 Orchard Street, but their stories connect directly to a story of a couple, Joseph and Bridget Moore, who did live at 97 Orchard Street. And we've been telling the story of Joseph and Bridget Moore since 2008. In our new exhibit that's opening in 2022, we'll be actually connecting the stories of these two Joseph Moores. Both Joseph Moores were waiters. Of course, both of them shared the same name. And so the museum will be exploring these two family stories, really setting the history in the 1860s when these two Joseph Moores are sharing the same city. And this new exhibit, it will create space for us to explore how we got to where we are today in the United States through connecting stories of European immigrants and Black Americans in the 19th century. So, we have a few projects at the Tenement Museum that are really helping us expand our stories and include stories of Black and African American experiences in our work and our exhibits. And an important aspect of understanding, in particular, the story of Joseph and Rachel Moore in the 1860s, is to actually better understand the history of Black communities earlier in New York City, to understand the city into which Joseph and Rachel Moore moved. So what was New York like for Black residents in the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s? What debates and conversations were Black New Yorkers engaging in? So tonight's conversation will take us into that context as the Tenement Museum is building our research to explore the story of Joseph and Rachel Moore. So In the Shadow of Slavery, African Americans in New York from 1626 to 1863 is a seminal work that covers this history. So we're honored to have with us tonight Leslie Harris, author of the book and professor of history at Northwestern University. So I will take a moment to introduce Leslie and introduce our moderator, Lauren O'Brien, and then turn it over to the two of them to get our conversation started. So Leslie Harris is the author and co-editor of 3 award-winning books. So tonight's book, In the Shadow of Slavery, published in 2003. She was the co-editor with Ira Berlin of a groundbreaking exhibit at the New York Historical Society, Slavery in New York. She co-edited this book with Ira Berlin. And Slavery and Freedom in Savannah, published in 2014, co-edited with Dana Ramey Berry in collaboration with Telfair Museum's Owens Thomas House. From 2004 to 2011, Harris also co-founded and co-directed the Transforming Community Project at Emory University, which used history to engage members of the university community in dialogue, research, and teaching on racial and other forms of human diversity. And Harris has recently completed Slavery and Sexuality, Reclaiming Intimate Histories in the Americas with Dana Ramey Berry, and Slavery and the University, Histories and Legacies with James T. Campbell and Alfred L. Bromfield. Harris is currently the Beatrice Shepard Blaine Fellow at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard University. So welcome, Leslie. Such a pleasure to have you with us here tonight. Thank you for joining.
Thanks for inviting me.
And in conversation with Leslie will be Lauren C. O'Brien, who is a public historian interested in preserving stories that explore the relationship between Black placemaking, public memory, and geographies of displacement. She has worked as an educator, researcher, and curator in several historical institutions, including the Jane Addams Hull House Museum, the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture, and most recently, the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. Lauren is currently a PhD candidate in American Studies at Rutgers University, Newark, and the lead project researcher for the Tenement Museum's Joseph and Rachel Moore exhibit, and was the lead researcher for our Reclaiming Black Spaces walking tour initiative. So welcome, Lauren. Thank you so much for being with us tonight. And I will turn it over to the two of you to dive into conversation about the topics and stories of this book, your respective research. And for those of you in the audience, we do hope to hear from you as well. Please share your comments, your questions as we move through the conversation tonight. We will be saving about 15 minutes towards the end of the conversation for your questions, but certainly share your questions throughout, and we can make sure that they get to Leslie and Lauren. Lauren, take it away.
Thank you, Kat. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. So I will jump right in, starting with a question about your inspiration, Leslie. I know you begin your book talking about the 1991 discovery of the African burial ground, which, if you may or may not know, that really changed the public memory, I would say, of Black history as well as slavery, not only in New York, but in the United States. So I'm just curious if you could share more, if it was that event or what really inspired you writing this text?
First, thanks for being a part of this conversation with me and for the work you're doing with the Tenement Museum, which I'm really excited about. So in terms of my book on New York, putting it in the context of the burial ground is important, but I was already thinking about Black New York City in this earlier period. I was in my second year of graduate school, which would have been 1989, 1990, I read a book by Christine Stanzel called City of Women, which was about working class, mostly white women in New York City. And she's a beautiful writer. It's an amazing book. I wanted to be an historian who wrote books like she did. But one of the questions I had was, what was the nature of the Black population? I had taken courses as an undergrad that talked about the Harlem Renaissance period, and of course it's such a vibrant moment for Black history in New York, and I became really curious about what was going on in New York before the Civil War. So I began poking around, looking for newspapers, learning about Freedom's Journal, the first Black newspaper in the United States, and then I went to the New York Historical Society, hoping that I would find something, but really not sure. And then the first thing I saw, I guess this was about my third year in graduate school, the first thing I saw were the records of the Colored Orphan Asylum, which take up just about a chapter, a little more than a chapter in my book. And part of my book ends with the burning of that asylum. And once I saw those records, I knew that I could write a book about New York, that there were many more stories about New York City than I'd been led to believe. And I then spent the next decade or more reading, writing, researching, and thinking about African Americans in New York. In the midst of all, sort of while I was still in graduate school, of course, in 91 was the discovery of the African burial ground. And I was not in New York when that happened. In fact, I was in graduate school in California doing most of the basic research. So I came back and forth to New York, but I wasn't really involved in that project. And I was more of an archival person, and that project felt very much archaeological and physical it involved physical anthropology in a way that I wasn't really familiar with or comfortable knowing more about. And that project and what I was doing just seemed to be on different time frames, even in terms of how the research came along. So, but of course, the African burial ground turned up in the archives all the time and in works around New York. So it was important to frame my book with that knowledge of what that meant, as you said, to our public perception of New York. And there's a way in which, without the burial ground project, without that project, I think that project really helped me to understand the scale of my own book. And I think it also helped other people understand the importance of this history. I'm sure that it was part of why the New York Historical Society took another look at the Black history that they had in their own archives, and then, worked to have the Slavery in New York show. That discovery of the burial ground, the politics, the public outcry about it and discussion really did, I think, change for many New York residents their understanding of the African American presence in the city.
Thank you. And thank you even for your scholarship as a researcher for the Tenement Museum. Your text, both with Ira Berlin and then your separate text that we're featuring today, really provided a foundation for my work on the Reclaiming Black Spaces tour, as well as for the Joseph Moore. And while Reclaiming Black Spaces spans, multiple centuries, Joseph Moore really focuses on the 19th century Black life. And you kind of brought this up earlier, where that specific period between right before the Civil War, after, and then after it, and thinking about the draft riots as well. And so I wanted to ask you, what was life like for Black New Yorkers between emancipation and the Civil War? And how did that even compare to maybe life as we knew it for this time in the South?
That's a great comparison. So, New York City is part of what historians have called the first emancipation. And I think that we still should examine a little bit what was going on in that time period and how it compares to what happens in the South during and after the Civil War. There are things that happen in New York with the newly freed people and with free Black people down to the Civil War that I think mirror or precursor to what happens in the South. So one thing that happens in New York with emancipation is you have a small group of whites who align with Blacks as reformers and build build schools and really see a need in their perception to work with newly free Black people to get them settled into what it means to be free. Now, in the book, I have a lot of discussions about what that means and what it doesn't mean and how successful it is. There's an assumption that enslaved people who have been working all their lives, because the definition of slavery is working for someone else, there's a kind of assumption that they need assistance in figuring out how to work for themselves as free people. And that's a little problematic. There is, though, I think the white reformers, the New York Manumission Society in particular, are vigilant also in educating white people about what Black freedom means. And that, I think, is really important. That you have whites who own slaves who don't want to just free them. That's one big problem. You have some whites who want to try to sneak around the laws and sell enslaved people south to get their money back out. And so, in the early years, as Black people become free, there's some danger for them as a community. There are some whites who are very resentful of Black freedom. One of the people I quote in my book says the laws about a man who he had held as a slave. The laws freed him, let the laws take care of him. That whites don't want to employ formerly enslaved people as free laborers. They don't want to pay them wages. And even people who didn't own slaves sometimes didn't want to work alongside or employ these newly free Black people, not because they didn't have skills, but simply because they had been enslaved and because of, frankly, racism. Racism grows out of not only slavery, but also resentment of freedom. So that's on the one hand, really trying to manage white racism. On the other hand, I mentioned earlier Freedom's Journal, one of many Black newspapers that are founded in New York among free Blacks through the antebellum period. There are also other periodicals, the Anglo-African Magazine, which is founded a little closer to the Civil War. And probably the most important thing, there are a number of Black churches, and I know we often talk of the Black church as though there's only one, but there's a very diverse group of Black churches, and I think we still need to do more research on how they differed, why there are all these denominations. Some African Americans are in parishes that are under the aegis of a white denomination, or Peter Williams is a famous white Episcopalian priest. There's the Colored Presbyterian Church, which is a congregation which is headed by Samuel Cornish, who is also one of the co-founders of Freedom's Journal. But then there are, of course, the AME, African Methodist Episcopal, and African Methodist Episcopal Zion churches, and then there may even be others. Those are the ones I'm remembering. And so there's a very vibrant religious community, Christian largely, as far as we know so far, but very broken up in these different denominations. And these churches are sometimes not only about religion, they're also about Sunday school. They're about schools for children, adult night school, and sources of political activism. So, and charity work as well. So Black churches become one of the community's methods of adjusting to freedom, of trying to help people survive, of making sure that people learn how to read and write in particular. Literacy and education is incredibly important to this community. And this is true in the South as well, if we want to make a comparison. Some of the first institutions that are founded both with emancipation in the North and emancipation in the South, churches and schools, and often those are connected. Black people know that that if they can learn to read and write, that they can begin to seize their own destiny. From reading employment contracts, even though whites in the South, of course, with sharecropping, do cheat people and do the math incorrectly. But Black people know that they can fight if they know how to read and write. If they can, and also it's important for politics. It's important to know what's going on in the world around them. So literacy is incredibly important, and Black communities often, according to their economic status, often are more literate than similar white communities at the same time, that they outstrip in terms of literacy other white communities of a similar economic standing. I guess one other thing I would say about Black people, North and South, during emancipation is, for many, there's an effort to move away from their former enslavers. And we see this in New York, where although Blacks live in what we would say are integrated communities, they do try to move away from the people who enslaved them. And if I'm remembering correctly, they're more on the edge of the city as enslaved people, but with freedom, they move more to the West. And they also tend to cluster around institutions that are friendly to African Americans. So of course, Black churches, but also churches that are, say, the home of anti-slavery activists, or charity institutions that are supportive of Blacks. If we think about the African free schools, that these are often become nodes for the creation of free Black communities, where Black people are trying to create their own way of living independently of the people who used to enslave them. It's still a small city, though, compared to the way we think of New York today. And I'm sure that there are still moments when they run into their former enslavers or whatever, but they are trying to create their own sense of what New York City is apart from that experience of slavery. So that gives you sort of a basic, one more important thing, which we'll probably talk about more, is that, and this is true for urban areas, north and south, is that women outnumber men. In New York, during and after emancipation, I think through the whole antebellum period, there are 2 women for every 1 man in New York City in terms of the African-American community. Part of that may be because women can find employment more easily in the city as domestic laborers for most of the pre-Civil War era. Also, Black men are disproportionately sailors, and so they may be gone for weeks, months, or even years at a time on sailing ships, either up and down the coast, but also, far into the Atlantic Ocean, perhaps even the Pacific Ocean. So that's another thing to think about in terms of life in New York and in other cities with freedom.
Thank you. It's so interesting and fascinating to think about the world that Black New Yorkers or just Black residents of New York were carving even prior to prior to the Emancipation Proclamation, to what often is marked as, the time of emancipation and freedom. But also understanding that freedom was still very fragile, where I know often in schools, or I think in the public imaginary, the North is kind of framed as this, place of freedom where, the Underground Railroad, and once you get here, you are secure. But as you kind of mentioned, and what I'm getting at with my next question is where there were white New Yorkers that were invested in still maintaining Black servitude, even if Black New Yorkers were already emancipated. And so one question I wanted to ask about is, how did the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act impacted, Black New Yorkers or those in, communities around the city as well?
Yeah, the 1850 Fugitive Slave Law really hammers Black New Yorkers and Black urban communities in the North. This was a law that basically not only required, but incentivized finding Black people to be fugitives from slavery in the South. So on the one hand, it solidified an argument that Northern states had been having with the South for a very long time, whether or not Northern states had to return enslaved people to the South if those people escaped slavery and came north. For New York, there are laws back and forth from the 1790s, the early 1800s. One law that changes a little bit depending on who's governor is, for example, if an enslaved person comes north with their enslaver, and a lot of Southerners come to New York. New York is seen as a place largely friendly to slaves, to slavery, and to the South. So there are a lot of economic connections. A lot of cotton, of course, goes through the New York harbor. There are just a lot of ways in which, and family connections too, which we don't talk about enough, but there are people who are Southerners who have families in northern cities. And of course, people who go to school in the North and have friends. So there's a lot more connections across that Mason-Dixon line than we want to think about. But one of the laws said that if an enslaved person came north with their enslaver, after 6 months, they could claim freedom. So if someone, from the South moved north with their lady's maid or with their manservant or whatever, if they met with New Yorkers, particularly with Black New Yorkers who knew the law, those Black New Yorkers or white New Yorkers, anti-slavery New Yorkers, might help them gain freedom. That caused tension. Fugitive slaves, whether or not fugitive slaves should be returned. And Southerners would send what were called blackbirders or slave catchers to urban areas, and particularly to New York, and have those people look for their former slaves. Now, This is before DNA. This is, I think, even before fingerprinting. You're sending your agent with a description of a Black person, sound familiar? And that, they would pick up people. So sometimes, it's not clear that they picked up the right person at all. So you would be taken, if I were said to be, oh, that's Leslie, my slave from, Baltimore, or my slave from Savannah, I would have to try to prove that I am not that enslaved person. I might go to court and say, I was born here, and this person knew me from when I went to the African Free School at the age of 8, and I have worked from this as a domestic for this employer, and perhaps she would come and testify on my behalf in court. So it could get very complicated. Sometimes, as if you remember the Solomon Northup story, that was not just a one-off. Sometimes people would simply take people and take them south. And in my book, I talk about some children who are kidnapped that way. They are children, of course, work from a much younger age then than now. And there are a couple of children who I talk about, one young girl who's on the way to get water for her family one morning, and she never comes home and is believed to have been kidnapped. So there are legal and illegal kidnappings happening throughout the antebellum period. But with the 1850 Fugitive Slave Law, it gives those who are coming north to reclaim their property, as they said, much more legal standing to do that. Mm-hmm. And it also incentivized judges. If a judge finds the person who's brought up to court to prove his or her freedom, if the judge finds that person free, he only gets $5, and it's all he's at this point, of course. If the judge finds that person to be enslaved, he gets $10. So if the judge needs a little extra spending money, he might fine for the slave catcher rather than for that person's freedom. This 1850 is a turning point for New Yorkers, Black New Yorkers, but also for many urban Black people. We see a dramatic drop in the population of African Americans in cities between about 1840 and 1860. And 1850 is critical to that, I think. We have people who begin to first try to move to rural areas where they think they will not be subject as much to this kind of poaching by these slave catchers. Of course, we also have people who famously leave. We have groups that go to Canada. People like Frederick Douglass debate leaving the country. People who are high profile speakers who have been speaking about being fugitives from slavery, theoretically, their enslavers could now come and take them. And so we have, say, William and Ellen Craft, the husband and wife team. She dresses up as a man, as a white man, and he acts as her manservant, and they ride first class on trains north. Well, when the Fugitive Slave Law happens, they're very concerned that they have been speaking about their experiences as enslaved people. But with the Fugitive Slave Law, anyone in any of the northern states could come up to them and say, I'm acting on behalf of this federal law, and you are a fugitive, and I'm going to take you in and make sure that you are returned to slavery. So it's a very scary moment for a lot of people, even if they're very high profile. And some people go to Europe to wait out what's going to happen. Mary Ann Shadd Cary and many others moved to Canada. And there's a big debate in the Black community about whether or not the United States is a place to be, or whether African Americans should move to Liberia, to Sierra Leone, to Haiti, to Black dominated places as well. It's a very stressful moment.
Wow, that was like so much, but just great to even think about. And even as you were talking, where we've had this conversation before, and how it relates to one of the news stories that the Tenement Museum will be sharing about Joseph Moore, where Joseph Moore is an African-American man who is free, who moves from rural New Jersey around 1850, 1860, that time period that you said was a very stressful, scary time where many Black New Yorkers are fleeing the city. He and his wife actually moved to New York City at this time. I want to bring up a slide really quick. Okay, and so this is a slide that will be featured in the new exhibit. And so the new Joseph Moore, who is from a rural part of New Jersey, which is Warren County or Belvedere. And so as Leslie was speaking about the Fugitive Slave Act and how sometimes there are locals or people who are not necessarily the enslavers empowered to go kidnap or return fugitive enslaved people, where in this case, there's a gentleman that comes to look for several people living in Belvedere, where our Joseph Moore is from. And so I'll read a little bit from this so on Monday evening, last 3 persons visited Belvedere for the purpose of identifying certain Negroes for a number resident in this neighborhood who were suspected to have escaped from the patriarchal bondage of the South. Finding their papers to be defective and informal, they were compelled to return on Tuesday morning for further vouchers. In the meantime, the suspected fugitives got wind of the danger and fled to a place of safety. Among these fugitives from home and friends was an old, respected Negro who was resided in Belvedere for 37 years, gathering around him a family, acquiring considerable property, and being a worthy and respected member of the Methodist Church. In these cases, they out the person who is considered as someone who's involved with the nefarious business or a Judas of trying to get pieces of silver for, returning these. We don't know if these are fugitive enslaved people or not, but he's engaged in this kidnapping. And so one question that comes from this is, and this kind of relates to what you were speaking to earlier, is how can, in understanding that you can't really protect one's sovereign security, where Joseph Moore is born free, he doesn't have freedom papers. In Belvedere, where he's from, in his small town, you see a case of a gentleman where I don't know what papers he had himself, where even his establishment in a church and all these local institutions cannot save him. So why might someone, move away from their hometown where they do kind of have that network to verify, that they are a long-term resident? Why would they move to New York City, especially at a time where kidnappings are happening rampantly?
That's a great question. And with Joseph Moore, it is counterintuitive to most of the patterns that I saw, where people, if they moved, and there's an encouragement even among Black leaders to move to rural areas. There a famous discussion, long-term discussion of moving people out of New York, because not only because of the danger of kidnapping, but also because New York had been really difficult in terms of employment. It's thought to be somewhat immoral. African Americans are not able to buy property very easily. Remember also that the 1850s are when Seneca Village is destroyed to make way for Central Park, and that was the site of the most number of Black homeowners. So our Joseph Moore is a very interesting counterexample, where for whatever reason he felt that Belvedere was not as safe. Now remember that New Jersey, unlike New York actually puts an end date on slavery within its boundaries in 1827. New Jersey technically still has slavery. And it could be that he felt that Belvedere and this moment that maybe everybody was just a little too close to Delaware, which of course for our purpose is a slave state still. It's interesting to me that there's that these people, the master, the enslaver, appears to be from Delaware, so that's close. You've told me through your research also that he does not move alone to New York. He moves with his wife. He moves, and then his brother, I think, and his mother join him. So it could be a combination of tired of being in New Jersey, which is still technically a slave state, although the numbers of enslaved people have dropped dramatically, very close to Delaware, which really is a slave state and still has plantation slavery to some degree, and maybe wanting greater economic possibility too, that perhaps Belvedere is, has a limit. Some of these small, more rural areas, if you don't own land, you could be pretty limited in terms of what your economic possibilities are. So he may have thought, well, one more thing on the scale with this moment of kidnapping. Let's try. And we do have to remember, I mean, New York, for many people, was a place of enormous opportunity. It was a place of community. So even if there was a small, it sounds like there was a small Black church maybe, so there's a small community there, but New York, for many rural people, is a place of great opportunity. Also, even though New York might be dangerous in some ways, it is also an enormous center of political activism, of anti-slavery activism, of pro-racial equality activism. He wanted to be a more direct part of the struggle than might have been possible in a more rural area. All things I don't know, we'll ever find
I
out.
know
Sure.
the possibilities. They're still exciting to think
yeah.
about, though.
Yeah, lots of possibilities.
Thank you for sharing, some of your thoughts on that. So this is kind of returning to something you briefly mentioned earlier on the topic of women. And so I know it's already difficult in covering, Black stories at this moment, especially those who are not elite or well-known. And so what was your experience in covering stories about women at this time in New York?
I really, I found it difficult. I think many of the, on two levels. One is that many of the stories of Black women were not as obvious as stories of Black men, particularly in terms of activism. And I felt, having studied not only New York, but also looked at the history of Philadelphia that had been written about, and even Boston, that there were, in some ways, Black women who were wealthier, Black women, the Fortin family, for example, and many others in Philadelphia, who were also much more outspoken and seemed to be much more obviously involved in anti-slavery movement than was true in New York. The New York community as a whole, remember when the radical anti-slavery movement splits, the more radical version is in New England with the Garrisons, and the more conservative version is New York with the Tappan brothers, and I would say, with some of the African Americans in New York are a little bit more conservative. And remember, the split occurs over the role of women generally in the anti-slavery movement. And so I had a sense that there wasn't as much space for public speaking around Black women, at least at the time that I was researching. And my example in the book, although I'm happy to be proven that I sort of exaggerated a little bit too much, was Mariah Stewart, who was believed to be the first woman to speak before what were called promiscuous or mixed audiences. So this is an African-American woman who is speaking against slavery. She is in the same milieu, if you will, with David Walker, who wrote David Walker's Appeal in 1829. Her husband and David Walker are friends. Both men die. She's actually a widow at the time of her greatest speech writing and speech making. And so she is a powerful, I would say, feminist voice. She writes speeches saying, "Daughters of Africa, free yourselves from dishes. You have many more important things to do in the world." And she also tells men, you should be much more active politically than you are. So she gets driven out of Boston. People are like, you are too much. And in my account, she goes to New York and she's kind of silent. There's no account of her making speeches when she comes to New York. Now, she is involved in activism, but I think she's a school teacher, but she doesn't rise to the level of, no one is saying, oh, Mariah Stewart is here. She's not, there aren't articles written about her in that same way. Later on, apparently she moves to DC, and there are some people who are now following some publishing she did when she was in DC. So I found Black women in New York difficult to find in the Fortin family are in the anti-slavery movement. They have letters, they have diaries in the Library Company of Philadelphia. There are amazing resources to uncover them. I don't have the same materials, or I didn't find the same materials for Black women in New York in the middle class. And then the working class, I have some discussion of Black women. But of course, that's often unfortunately, through the lens of criminal activity or other things. Mm. But I remain hopeful that, I couldn't do everything. So there's the possibility that we can continue to do more and try to figure out more about who Black women are and what they're doing in New York.
Yeah, it seems like even in thinking about even recent scholarship on New York, where it's now like looking to those sources, like you said, the more criminalized accounts of Black women, or even trying to read through like the absence to try to see what's there, or even to kind of imagine, kind of like we did with Joseph Moore, the possibilities from the lack of information. One thing I want to bring up is another slide of an initiative that was started by some Black women, where kind of this goes to your point about the lack of public space or forums. And so I'm wondering, in thinking about, well, first I'll introduce this. And so for all you watching, so this is an article that was printed in a Black newspaper called The Colored American, advertising a Black female trading co-op. And this co-op consisted of about 100 Black women, and this is 1841, shop owners, where they had their own small businesses and they came together in one physical location to sell goods. And so as you can see, like in the second paragraph, some of those goods range from cocoa, coffee, spices, candles, cheese, just a range of things. And although the Colored American themselves says that this is the first establishment of this kind, I did want to look at, through my research, other potential co-ops or grocery stores, and one was David Ruggles, where he has a grocery store. And thinking about that, in this grocery store, it also served a purpose as like a bookstore. And as an abolitionist, he still did abolitionist activity. And so I'm wondering, obviously this is conjecture because we don't know if it's possible, in thinking about the story that you told, where although this is, a commercial enterprise, if it's possible that women could use the spaces that they kind of had more free terrain in to do more public activity, or to speak in a way they wouldn't have space to in more, I guess, mainstream or traditional public political spaces.
This female trading association is really fascinating. One, because, as you said, because it's commercial. And so this is a group of women who are coming together. Now, one thing that could have made it more political, but it might have been assumed by the Colored American. And again, the Colored American is published by Samuel Cornish, I believe, who of course is an anti-slavery activist. When you're looking at a Black newspaper at this time, you're talking about people who are in the anti-slavery movement. And one of the things that the anti-slavery movement at this time does is, they really, in some ways, initiate the boycott, the idea of not using slave-produced goods. So I'm looking at the things that are sold, and I wonder if it was assumed that these would be free produce, as it's called, that these would not be goods produced by enslaved people, but they would be produced by free people. The only thing that gives me pause is coffee, sugar, and even cocoa maybe. And I just would wonder where they would get free produce in terms of those goods at the time. Well, I will answer my own question. Perhaps from Haiti. Perhaps there's a Haitian thing, right? Possibly. I mean, so that's one thing to think about in how a grocery store, as today, I mean, for me and for many of us, thinking about climate change, thinking about what fair trade, I think, is a term that's used today, where you shop, what you buy, how you interact with the food chain, as it's called, the supply chain, can become political. And many anti-slavery women in particular, but men and women, focused on trying to get people not to buy slave-produced goods of all kinds. So it's possible that this female trading association is one that the act of visiting becomes an act of support for the anti-slavery movement. They don't say here, but you mentioned David Ruggles grocery store, where it's also a reading room. And these women may well have abolitionist literature available for the people who visit their shop, who visit that space. It could be a way to expand the network of people who understand that what you buy matters.
Mm.
So I would be surprised if it, well, anyway, I'm very curious about its connection to the anti-slavery movement. I would be surprised if it did not have a connection in some way.
So again, we see more connections to freedom and people kind of making a way, in a sense, out of, as cliche as it sounds, out of no way.
But it's true. I mean,
Yeah.
they are thinking that. And you know, again, these communities are not simply thinking about Manhattan only, or Brooklyn, or just, you know, as we would say, the five boroughs or whatever. These Black communities during this time, Black newspapers, they report on the diaspora. The anti-slavery movement is one that is very much international, that is concerned with what is happening to people of African descent in other places. For example, celebrating August 1st, the end of slavery in Jamaica, in the quote unquote West Indies, West Indian Emancipation Day. That is a holiday that is celebrated in these places as just one of many examples of the ways in which African-American New Yorkers see themselves as part of a larger world. So, yeah.
So our last, I know we can continue to talk, but so we can open it up. I have one final question is, you know, since publishing this book, you know, what have you learned, and even thinking about this present moment, what are the stories that give us lessons for today? That's a hard one.
No, well, you know, I still think that the one lesson that I still take away from this book is what it means, lesson/question. What does it mean to be radical? What does it mean to be in a radical interracial movement? I still have so much admiration, sympathy for the radical abolitionists, Black and white. And what it meant for white people at this time to try to work on a basis of equality with Black people. You know, William Lloyd Garrison walking into meetings and saying, I come as one of you. I come as a colored man, trying to shed himself of white privilege. But even before he did that, his movement to the radical side of abolition came out of a listening tour, if you will, that he did. Now, today we think of politicians doing listening tours, and we're like, really? Mm-hmm. But he traveled up and down the Eastern Seaboard, going to Black churches to ask them their opinions about colonization, about this movement that wanted to send Blacks home to West Africa. And he then published a book called Garrison's Thoughts on Colonization, but it was really what he had learned by listening to Black people's own desires, what they thought of their futures. And what they were saying was, this is our home. And so that really began his movement to radicalism. And I think the lesson of this movement is one in which no one was perfect, but they were in struggle together, and they had to figure out over and over again what the contours of their politics were, what it meant, what racial equality really meant. That was something that I talk about a lot in the book, and they didn't get it right. And then it changed generationally. There's the generation that was born in the North into slavery still, but it's very different from, say, when Frederick Douglass comes to town, or, you know, when fugitive slaves from the South come in and they are younger and they bring a new energy, or even David Ruggles, who is not from the South, but who is a fiery leader. And so you have both interracial, but you also have intraracial tensions. You know, Samuel Cornish hates David Ruggles. He thinks David Ruggles is a young upstart and is a mess and is, you know, he messes up the books for the organization. And anyway, so I think thinking about how change happens and how hard it is when you're really trying to overthrow not only an external system, but a system that you're so deeply implicated in yourself. And that has existed for your whole life and more, your parents' lives, them before then. How did these people get the nerve, to do that? Well, part of it is that they listen to Black people telling them that this is not good, that this goes against your own very stated ideals. So we definitely need to continue some more of that today. Unfortunately, one of the lessons of my book too, which ends with the New York City draft riots, is sometimes flagrant violence is what leads to change. And I will never be satisfied with that. I think about the Charleston martyrs, and that for decades, people said that the Confederate flag should not fly. And it was only with their death, not with our reasoned language, that we got the Confederate flag taken down. I think about George Floyd's murder. And only by watching that horrific video of his death are we finally getting, not finally, I mean, there's been movement, but that really turned the world on its head. But really, does that always have to be the price? So, and certainly the draft riots were a moment like that also for New York, that the lynching of, I believe it was 27 New Yorkers, the burning of numerous institutions that were believed to be either elite or catering to Black people, not least of them the Colored Orphan Asylum. That is what led the white elite to say, oh, wait a second, maybe we need to do a little bit more on this issue of racial equality and slavery. The white elite beyond the anti-slavery movement. But did you really have to have your whole city burned down for that to happen? Jeez, they've been talking about this for decades. So I'm not sure what that says, unfortunately, but those are the kinds of lessons that I still think about and take from the book. And I keep hoping that the kind of nonviolent, peaceful, thoughtful activism that the radical abolitionists tried to do in an interracial setting will one day continue to win out. But
sorry, I'm muted. Thank you so much, Leslie. That was so insightful. And I even trying to think about, what will it take in this moment where, it hurts to see the parallels of the past, but I am hopeful as you spoke that, things can be different with the future. And so I know Kat is back where we want to hear some questions.
Well, thank you both so much. And I do just, want to acknowledge how your reflections on the lessons of this book, certainly reading the book, I, as a white person, I had a similar reaction, just sort of looking at how I can see radical activism in the past from within white communities in New York, and how we can all be and must be, right, working towards change and drawing hope from both the positive and dark sides of the city's past. So thank you for sharing, all of your expertise and particularly just having written this book, at the turn of the last century, right? What lessons we carry with us, but right, that this is it's helpful to revisit that and hear, okay, where are we now? And we have a fan of your work, Dr. Harris, with us tonight. Elise L. wrote, Dr. Harris, I loved your book. And it says that they ended up writing 2 papers on court cases featured in the book.
Oh, great. Oh, that's so
incredible inspiration there. But Elise was curious, what are your favorite stories that you uncovered in your research? So I know if you have another 3 hours.
Right, exactly. Probably the stories, and I couldn't tell all of them, from the orphan asylum. And I was thinking as I was talking about women's activism in New York, but the orphan asylum is a great example of Black and white women, and the white women are much less radical. And the Black women, these are not official abolitionists, but they are working on a different kind of politics, right? Of the politics of how would I put it? These Black women who are trying to do right by their children. They are employed, some of them are live-in domestics. There's one woman who I talk about who in the early years of the orphanage, she has escaped slavery in Virginia, and she puts her children in the orphanage so that they will have a better life. And she's constantly in struggle with the white women who run the orphanage because she wants to see her children more often. And they're saying visiting hours are this, and what's your problem? And so they write about that in the minutes. And then she passes away. And it's one of the most devastating stories. But the ways in which that orphanage and those women, the white women, had to respond to Black people, because for the white women, this was a mark of their charity. And if they didn't actually listen to what these women and children said they wanted, they would fail too. So there is a negotiation that happens in my reading on both sides. The other, I'll mention one more thing, and it's sort of connected to the orphanage, but beyond, is James McCune Smith is one of my favorite people. So he becomes the doctor for the orphans eventually, and that's a pretty radical move on their part because he is a very strong anti-slavery activist. He is also one of the first people to really speak against racist science. So if you read the 1619 Project and Linda Villarosa's article about Black people in the 19th century, there were these arguments that Black people had a different lung capacity and physiology. Well, James McCune Smith in New York is writing against that. He is a trained medical doctor from Glasgow, and he takes it all on. There are white New Yorkers, medical scientists, who are saying that Black people have different physiology, and he writes against that. So they take him on as their doctor, replacing the white doctor they had before. Unfortunately, the minutes where that happens are missing, so I don't know the actual complete story of why suddenly in the next, there's a couple of years missing, and then James McCune Smith, our doctor, came to visit. I'm like, what? So anyway, the Colored Orphan Asylum records are amazing, amazing. So that's probably my favorite stories.
Mm. And it's always, I think, the best part to hear from a historian, sort of what has risen to the surface for you in all of the research you did and the sources you looked at. We have actually another question from Elise about, I think, sort of continuing this thought about the medical science of a particular time period. Elise mentions that their undergraduate thesis was on birth control in the United States in 1900, and really noting that it was largely white focused. So Elise is wondering if you have any research or any sources to point to or learn about birth control movements or efforts from within sort of non-white sources or communities.
Oh, interesting. No, but I know somebody who might. Michelle Mitchell, and if you're in New York, she's a professor of history at NYU, and she wrote a wonderful book called Righteous Propagation about African Americans' gender, cultural reproduction, but she's an amazing historian, and she might know of about that. It's funny, I had a student who did an honors thesis when I was at Emory more focused on Margaret Sanger and birth control. And it was difficult to figure out, it was more clear about you say white, I think European immigration communities that she was working with. It's a little more complicated. I couldn't quite figure out what was going on in terms of African Americans and whether or not she was really making inroads there. The other thought I had is it might be necessary to look to the South, to really, especially if you're in that earlier 1900 time period, that there may be conversations going on in the South that are not happening in quite the same way up here. Finally, of course, Black newspapers are, if you want to know what's going on in the Black community, Black newspapers are the place to go. That's it.
That's right. And that there's an incredible online archive where you can search those newspapers, right?
Yep. Search. Now you can do a word search, which is amazing. So you will definitely want to do that. And even looking for ads. I mean, we just saw the Female Trading Association ads, but I'm sure there are also, is it pessaries? Anyway, there are all sorts of ads that use names that we don't use anymore for birth control, for female trouble and things like that. And so you might have to think about that, but I would take a look at that kind of material. Yeah.
Well, hopefully that's helpful, Elise, and thank you for writing in with those questions. And I know for at the Tenement Museum, some of our more recent tours have focused on women's health and sort of birth control movements and midwifery within the European immigrant communities of the women who lived in 97 Orchard Street. So helpful. I think we'll have to look into this scholar's work as well to get a sense of just how to deepen the perspectives on how women are trying to control their own fertility. So that's really really helpful. I do just want to address one more question from Annette. In our final moments, are there any descendants left of African American free or enslaved people still living in the area? And I know broadly, right? Broadly, the answer is yes, but I'd be curious to hear sort of both of your thoughts on this question.
Christopher, who used to work at the Schomburg, who wrote the first essay in slavery in New York, traces his ancestry back to some of the earliest enslaved people. I think to the first 11. I apologize for forgetting his name, age. But the other thing. What do I want to say about that? On the one hand, New York is one of those places that people come in, they go out, they cycle through, blah, blah, blah. But I think that there are descendants. I did a talk, it was the African American Genealogical Association with this is 10 years ago now. But there were a lot of people in that room uncovering their history, saying my internet connection is unstable. Am I still there? Okay, good. I'm sure that some of them are, that there were some descendants. No one's coming to mind in particular. Oh, one more thing I'll say, actually, I just remember James McCune Smith story, which is that after his death, I think in 1865, his family, passed for white. And when John Stauffer put together a volume of his writings, he also found descendants of James McCune Smith who did not realize that they were descendants and did not know who James McCune Smith was. And so there are descendants around. Finally, and this is a little farther afield, but Solomon Northup, around the time that the film came out, there was a website that showed all of his descendants. And so you've seen this website too. Yeah, it was incredible. And so with Ancestry and all of these online genealogy programs, I think more and more people are figuring out who they're linked to. So.
Yeah, I would agree about the genealogy. Genealogists are doing amazing work, creating family blogs that are public, and being able to trace. Mm-hmm. And so that's where I've seen it as well. And I'm sure there are, like you said, with this Solomon Northup, where sometimes there's the high profile, communities that are people connected to, more famous figures. But I think a lot of people personally are doing that work within their homes and kind of making those connections.
Yeah, definitely.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Which I think is always such a key part of what the Tenement Museum tries to think about is, how are people preserving their own stories and histories and doing their own research, and how do we connect that to the research that, historians like the two of you are undergoing. So I think that was the perfect question. Oh, yes, go ahead. Yes.
How could I forget Carla Peterson's book, Black?
Oh, yes, Carla. Yes, and she's spoken with us. So that's that is Black Gotham.
Yeah, that
Black
is
Gotham.
She is a descendant of Philip White, who is a colleague, I guess, a friend of the James McCune Smith and that whole generation of antebellum Black New Yorkers. Her book, Black Gotham, she talks about this ancestry and also the figuring out, how could I forget that so she would be someone, that book would be an amazing book if you're interested in this question of ancestry and who is still descendant. And it's incredible that how much she was able to find out about her ancestry. And Philip White he's not Frederick Douglass. He was important, but there are also these figures who are important more locally or don't have the sort of Frederick Douglass thing, but who are still, it's amazing to find them as well. So, I can't believe.
Thank you for remembering that.
I know, I'm so glad I did.
And yes, in addition to, we hope supporting Dr. Harris's work through purchasing In the Shadow of Slavery, the Tenement Museum's, online bookshop also has Carla Peterson's book, Black Gotham. So for viewers tonight, we are offering a special discount for the online shop, so you can get both of those books and continue, to learn about some of these stories that have been uncovered tonight. So thank you so much to the both of you. I'm so grateful to be able to have heard your expertise and your research. And thank you all, those of you joining us, for connecting. We hope you will stay connected to the museum. We will continue to have virtual programs even as things start to open up. So we do hope to see you again, whether virtually or in person. So take care, everyone. Thank you again, and hope to see you soon.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Lauren.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kat.
Thank you, Leslie. Bye, Kat.
Bye.